Let's talk about the military science of it all. Visual perspective. I know some of you, there have been some great experiments on visual perspective using the sun. I'm going to tie in military science because military science ties right in with visual perspective. Military sun and star shots, celestial survey, I'll talk a little bit about that. Weapons bore sighting really kind of brings it all together. Military science addresses atmospheric lensing and refraction. The sector range fan. In other words, we're going to use triangulation. Military science, the strategic and fundamental accuracy of military science is vital. Lives depend on its safe use and practice every day. And because second place in military science can get you conquered real quick. Understanding visual perspective. Many of you have seen the visual perspective. Look like looking down a hallway. If you're in a hotel or whatever and you're looking down one of those long hallways, you'll see that the sun at noon is right over top of us. We're at about 90 degrees or very high in the sky. Mid-afternoon, that starts to move away from us, and then the sunset, it moves linear. Okay? Moves linear. Opposite effect when you get in the morning. Now, what I want you to remember is remember this visual perspective outline, because I'm going to start to develop that through military science. I'm going to talk about the U.S. Marine Corps and the United States Army use M2 aiming circle, and this is what this device here is. It's a surveys device. It's to put artillery cannon pieces on the same or common line of direction, line of survey. Military uses it. It's called a M2 aiming circle. All right. In an artillery unit, we have a double check. In other words, you have a lay circle, primary aiming circle, and you have a safe circle. These circles are going to verify that you have the correct lay information. In other words, I want to be shooting the right way at the bad guys. I don't want to shoot at the good guys. So they're going to check. There is a double check verification within the system. That's why we use two circles. The safe circle will verify the lay circle is accurate. In this act, and I'll say it again, in this act, we can exclude atmospheric lensing and refraction. How? We can exclude it because in military, there are 360 degrees in a circle. The military artillery uses mils. In other words, there are 400 mils in a circle, 360-degree circle. They are more infinite. They are more defined. Why? Because we have to be very, very, very accurate. Because if we're not, we make a mistake, somebody dies. It's that simple. It is lethal. Again, accountability. What these two circles will do, one will use astrological survey, in other words, a sunshot. They will use a sunshot in the day or a star shot in the night. They will get their survey off of it. They will put an EOL, an end of orienting line, or a survey marker down. Once they set their survey in, the safe circle will come in and will go magnetic, grid magnetic, which is the same thing as going to what? Polaris, the North Star. Same thing. Going grid magnetic, they use alternate methods of lay. Once they do that, they will turn an angle on each other. You will face each other. And you will do what is called bumping. When you bump, in other words, when you're facing each other, I'm looking at you, you're looking at me. We have to be within 10 mils. Guess how wide 10 mils is? About that wide. Put 10 hairs together. We can now, 99% of the time, they will bump within 1 to 2 mils. In other words, from high angle down to 10 or 15 degrees, we can exclude atmospheric lensing and refraction. Military does it every day and night. In other words, when those folks at NASA tell you, well, that's due to atmospheric lensing and refraction, when we look up in the 2017 eclipse, I'm like, dude, you are so wrong. You are way out there. That's not what happens. There is very little, within about 1/8 of a degree. You may have some, but 99% of the time, you don't have any. Very minimal. The U.S. military does it day and night, and this is what I'm talking about. You're looking, I'll use the example, these circles, when you see these circles, they're like a ring. You read, the rule of thumb is you read from the outer ring into the middle. So if you see a number on the outside, you read that number into the middle. This example is 1/600. If you see red for the safe circle, you read red. So I read 1/600 to the safe circle has what? 1/600 back at me. We are 0 mils. That's how that works. Now I want you to remember when I talked about visual perspective, see how the walls and the floor and the ceiling all start to fill in. This is from Hasty Astro, from the U.S. military. We have our Indo-Orient, we have our survey. This transfers to the gun line, then it transfers down to where we're shooting down range. We can exclude the atmospheric lensing and refraction. Now we start to fill in the what? The visual perspective. Look at the shapes and the form, the floor, the hallway, the walls all start to fill in with visual perspective. This is how I develop STO and SIMO. Timing. Now we have the ceiling, we're using the sun. The sun becomes the EOL, or the line of survey. We're just transferring it. It all works. Process, application, accountability, and validation. It all comes together. The visual perspective is there. It all fills in. Again, just showing you the lines of parallel. You have limits left and right. The keys STO or SIMO both work within this application and process. And this is the 45-degree sector test box. This is why it works. Same thing with weapons live fire ranges. They do the same thing. Visual perspective, geometry, you have left and right limits, visual perspective. That shape is in everything that military science does with regards to gunnery and weapons. Every time that I saw, when I did my research, heliocentrism tried to creep into military science identified it and made it a non-factor. In other words, we'll put it in there, but we're not going to use it. I'll give you the example. In this table, ATB 3-0922, this is a weapons range fan, left and right limit. Your 200 mils left, 200 mils right. That's your fan. That's what you can fire your weapon. U.S. artillery weapons. Anytime you go outside that, you have to physically shift the weapon. So what they did is, cleverly, they've put in, you add 1 mil for the Earth's curve beyond 3-400. Well, guess what? You're going outside the limit. You have to physically shift the weapon. That's where you're going to get your 1 to 10 mil displacement. So whoever did this, they were very clever. Very, very clever. And they did the same thing for beyond 3,000. You're outside that weapon's range. Of course you're going to shift. You're going to have the 1 to 10 mil displacement. And in every instance I found this, I found 2. Here's the other one. If it's important for artillery, it's on this table. It is on this table. And then look at standard conditions. This is used every time. Meteorological data, temperature, wind. I want you to look at gun target line position. In other words, the position of the cannon to the impact area. Look at number 3. What does it say? No rotation of the Earth. This is a standard condition. In other words, hey, we identified the heliocentrists, however, we don't need you. It doesn't work. And then they listed the rotation of the Earth down here as a non-standard condition. Guess when they use non-standard? Never. It's never used. Very clever again. Everything else is very important. If it's on there, it's critical. Atmospheric lensing and refraction exists at 10 to 15 degrees down to the ground. The heliocentrists know this, and they will use that against you when you conduct your experiments. That's why I said, go up and use the sun, man. That's the real answer. Weapons bore sighting, the same thing. You have line of parallel. You can exceed, if you look here on the right, you have lines of parallel, the cannon tube and then the weapon sight. You can exceed the line of parallel. You can't. Otherwise, you're instituting a lead. You can adjust the weapon sight in towards the cannon tube, but you cannot exceed the line of parallel. You are instituting a lead. When I talked to the military guys about that, that's when it clicks for me. I said, remember when you do weapons bore sighting? Line of parallel. And oh, dude, I forgot about that. Sector range fan, real quick. Again, if you're 1 degree off your line of survey at 46 degrees or a cumulative total of 91 degrees, you're over 1.5 million miles off line of survey. That's how far their grid pattern is off. References for these links, they're on the website. Operation Resolute Time, the breakdown, where it took place in Kabul, Afghanistan. I did it in 2000, 18 May to 7 August, one of the most extensive tests in recorded history. Over 81 tests, the globe model outside, here's our test box, outside the prime meridian zone. I was 765 miles north in Kabul, Afghanistan, at a high altitude of 5,963 feet. High altitude. The globe model failed 57 of the 81 tests, or 70%. Think you're going to pass inside the prime meridian zone? You can't even pass the test outside and at high angle. We gave the globe model maximum major advantage of high altitude and outside the prime meridian zone, and it failed miserably. Again, we can calculate distance just by triangulation using a degree and the baseline distance at the Tropic of Cancer. We can figure the sun's distance, 3,500 miles from that position. I say the sun is between 3,000 and 4,000 miles. It's based on your position. What happens after sun angle, or their grid is off? The heliocentric, highly touted orbital mechanics does not work. In other words, when you see red, their orbital mechanics fails. In other words, you do not have the Earth rotating or spinning around a sun. It's not happening. Why? Your alignment's off. Dude, you're off by several million miles. In other words, you can't tell me that the sun is up here and your orbital mechanics work. It has to be down here. It has to be low angle. So that's why we do direct measurement, because that directly goes into orbital mechanics. Your positioning of these celestial bodies is out of alignment. You're out of alignment by several million miles off a line of survey. So your orbital mechanics goes into failure. So you're not orbiting around anything. You're stationary. Let me say that again, stationary. Where you see red, that's orbital failure. Orbital mechanics for the flat Earth, see any red on there? Just the prime meridian rings. It works, 90 degrees, no problem. Orbital mechanics on the flat Earth model works, too easy. I did Operation North Star. I started testing for the celestial body, the North Star. Again, off line of parallel from North Dakota at 46 degree parallel. We exceeded line of parallel by 3.2 degrees, or 334 billion, call it 335 billion miles off a line of survey. So not only the sun, the North Star. Let's talk about what we may live in, and I'm going to wrap this up. The enclosed system, projected objects, what we have within the system or what we may live in, an enclosed world. Now, I know that all flat earthers don't believe that we live in an enclosed system. However, we can tie it all in the enclosed system if we look at the stars as a power grid, now some of these stars may actually be projected objects, but some of them may be crystals used within salt water and charge the system. So in other words, this is kind of like, almost like a septic system, running and flowing. The tides would regulate that. The tides are built in so they fill the water reservoir. This keeps this system running. It's kind of like a car battery for an engine. If you take, and like they did nuclear testing and they shot nuclear missiles up in the high altitude, if you fracture the firmament, you could potentially damage the power system. Now I looked at it and I was like, man, they're going to kill the system. If you fracture that, these stars may actually power the sun. And now it may not look like this, but this is just to give the idea that this object is drawing power. It is a power grid. And if you don't know about salt water and electricity, I encourage you to look at it, because it is real. And this is how you would operate that system. You use the salt water, you use crystals within the star field, you can run this system. You want it self-supportive. You don't want to have maintenance on it. But if you fracture the firmament, this sun starts to turn what? Red, brown, and then black. You just killed the power system. It's like taking a car battery and taking a drill and drilling into the car battery, and your car battery goes dead because all the fluid drains out. Same thing. And these objects are highly likely that they are projected. They are projected objects. Now, I wouldn't worry too much about shooting rockets and nuclear weapons up at the firmament. You can't get enough thrust at high altitude to get up there. And I think the creators knew this. Physics works against rockets at high altitude. You have no thrust or lift capability. And that's a design safety factor. Why? Because we as humans, we're pretty dangerous. We're very destructive. But again, you have a flow that could come right from the ocean, fills right up into our sky, and right back down. Cyclic. It's too easy. Summary, we talked about